This week I'm joined by Jason W. Moore. He's an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University. He's the co-author of the important book, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, a guide to capitalism, nature, and the future of the planet. So first of all, Jason, I'd like to hear about how the last 5 or 6 months have been for you and what you've made of the political developments that we've seen.
Well, I think we're going to be making sense of the political developments for a while. It's clear that all of the fractures that Raj Patel and I talk about in A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things have created this dynamic of planetary instability that transcends the boundaries between what we usually think of as nature and society. And of course, health and public health is one of the greatest examples of what we call world ecology. That is the ways in which human relations of health, well-being, of power and production and profit are all natural and social at the same time. So what we're seeing politically is, on the one hand, the bankruptcy of the ruling classes of the rich countries in terms of their capacities to really deal with the pandemic. And we are seeing, well, what is the hallmark of our times, that as all of the conditions of the web of life, climate obviously, but everything is changing so dramatically. What we are going to see is the resurgence of mass pandemic disease and infectious disease. So anytime that you look historically at moments of climate shifts and a long-term transformation of physical environments, which includes farms and streams, but also cities and trade routes, whenever you see that, you will see episodes of pandemic. Whether or not ruling classes today are in any sense capable of negotiating this without the very blunt instruments that we've seen so far of just shutting everything down, it remains to be seen. But essentially, you know, as we know in the United States, the ruling class has been willing to crash the economy.
Yeah, and Adam Tooze described this in The Guardian as the first economic crisis of the Anthropocene. Do you agree with him?
Well, it's a promiscuous use of the term Anthropocene, which is best reserved for geological matters. Tooze is brilliant, and I think the spirit of the argument is, in a sense, on target. Whether it's the first or not, that remains to be seen. In my view, in a geological sense, the Anthropocene has been with us for over 4 centuries, dating from the Orbis spike, which results from this is the great concept and related, built on the research of Lewis and Maslin, the great geographers, that from 1610 we have a crash in carbon dioxide concentrations, not a rise, but a crash, because of the European invasion of the New World and the genocides that resulted from it. Everyone died, you have forest grow back, you have carbon drawdown, and that contributed, in fact, to capitalism's first great climate crisis in the early 17th century. So I think we want to be careful about throwing around these words that come out of geology and then applying them to the history of the modern world. They're really ill-suited to do so, and if we pause for a moment to reflect on the promiscuous extension of scientific language to human affairs, well, that's a very dark history. You can think about social Darwinism and certain kinds of socio-biological arguments. The work of people like Richard Dawkins, of course, deeply problematic in promoting a biologist notion of the inherent selfishness of humans and indeed life. So yes on the spirit of Tooze's remarks, no on the substance.
And we've seen the great incompetence from leaders such as Trump and Bolsonaro in the United States and your country and Brazil, respectively. Now, do you think this is a crisis of neoliberal capitalism, or do you see something else going on here?
I think both. it's certainly, we've been witnessing across the world, and as you rightly note, not only in places like the United States with Trump, who comes to power on the back of a critique of neoliberal politics as usual. Never mind that he has ruled entirely from the standpoint of neoliberalism as usual. He came to power on the argument that neoliberal politics was fundamentally flawed. So what we're seeing, not just in the United States, but across the semi-periphery of the world, you see Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and many other places around the world. You're seeing this right-wing, ethno-nationalist, populist politics come to the fore because it seems to speak to the actual crises of the world in a way that neoliberal politics, which is shared by social democratic as well as right and center-right politics and political parties in many cases, that neoliberal politics as usual is increasingly revealed as bankrupt. And that's one of the points that Raj Patel and I make in our book, 7 Cheap Things. We say that crises occur not when things are very, very bad, which they obviously are and have been for a long time. They happen when politics as usual is not delivering the same measure of stability and economic development in some broad-based form.
And one of the things we've seen in the commentary since the coronavirus came on the scene is this kind of return to nature narrative. And in April, air travel was down by about 90%. NASA images showed pollution decreases in China. Now, do you think this is kind of short-term thinking? Do you think that the pandemic's going to provide an impetus for action on climate change, or do you just think it's kind of short-term?
I think it's too soon to tell whether it will spark a more radical and universalist, in the best sense of that term, not in the Western modernist conception of that term, response. The danger is that that all of the anger feeds into various forms of ethno-nationalist on the right politics and identitarian politics on the left. And so both are going on. The identitarian tendency in place in the Anglo-American world, and especially in the United States, is very, very strong. It becomes a question of whether or not the broad-based mobilizations and outrage in a place like the United States, which of course is now and always has been an apartheid republic, whether that movement can go beyond calls for, say, defunding the police to grounding those arguments into a vision for black-white working-class unity, which was the historic contribution of American communism in the 20th century before its back was broken in the 40s and 50s. So we want to be careful about identifying so-called natural disasters, which of course are never natural disasters, but so-called natural disasters as sparks, because they may be sparks, but it's very, very contingent. And then related to your question, which is great, is there is a kind of reaffirmation, at least at the level of the media propaganda complex, a reaffirmation that this is the revenge of nature and that humanity is getting its due. And we want to look at that very, very, very carefully and very critically, because that whole discourse is a discourse with roots, well, in the history of colonialism and genocide from 1492, and then famously links up to Malthusian and neo-Malthusian imaginaries. And I would just point out that it is also climate change, or not climate change thinking, but little ice age thinking, that these notions of nature, population, humanity, civilization, all of these come out of a little ice age crisis in the 15th through the early 19th centuries that represented essentially the intellectual apparatus of European capitalist power and colonial domination.
So let's move on to the book and your work more generally. One of the things you're trying to do is critique the word Anthropocene. Now, what is your critique of it, and what do you want to replace that word with?
Well, let's acknowledge, as Earth system scientists will and climate scientists especially will do, that we have we already have a term for essentially for the human era, which is the Holocene. So the Holocene is an epoch that goes back 11,700 years. It is an interglacial period. So it's very unusual to name an interglaciation as an entire epoch. And what we want to take out of the best of Anthropocene thinking is the extraordinary research and debates, interpretive debates between geologists, earth system scientists, anthropologists, to look at that long history to understand that we have, as a species that has experienced civilization and settled agriculture, which is, let's be honest, has been very much of a mixed bag, that the whole history of human civilization, settled agriculture, class society has occurred within this Holocene, a period of unusual climate stability that is now over. So insofar as Anthropocene, Age of Man, directs our attention to the end of Holocene climate stability, I think that's a powerful intervention. I think it's a useful intervention. It's a fundamental description of the reality of our times. Now, to call it the Anthropocene is problematic because, of course, it is the end of climate stability is not the work of all human beings. And so, therefore, we want to look at which humans are responsible and which are not. And to adopt the Anthropocene uncritically is essentially to adopt the point of view of the colonizer, of the plantation owner, of the rich. This is a way of looking at the world that says, really, it's everyone's problem, and we, the rich and powerful, are simply acting out natural laws. So this is a kind of argument that germinates in the 16th century, in the aftermath of Columbus. And it forges a way of thinking that we all regard as common sense. That is, well, there's human beings over here and there's nature over there. What that conceals is that historically, and even today, most human beings are not fully regarded as fully human. So this might sound academic, but in fact, these everyday concepts that we use, like humanity, like nature, like society, like population, we treat them as innocent concepts. But in fact, these have been, as I said, the intellectual apparatus of class rule and colonial domination in historical capitalism. And they have been defended as either the law of nature or the law of civilizing projects, that it was the gift of Europeans, white, male, bourgeois, powerful, to give civilization to the rest of the world. And what that meant was something very specific, that all of the people who were not civilized or not yet civilized were savage. They were part of nature. So we want to be careful and not in a good way. Some of us might be thinking, well, oh, that's nice. No, that meant that they had to be civilized. So work will set you free, the motto that hung over the Nazi labor camps, was also, for all intents and purposes, and we tell this story in 7 Cheap Things, the motto of the Spanish colonizers, and indeed the motto of every great colonial power that comes to the shores of a new land, reclassifies the people who live there as savage and lazy and in need of civilization. How do you learn that? What is the school for civilization? Well, it's work. And work in very, very specific capitalist ways to produce profit. So a lot of the language that we treat as everyday language, Anthropocene, Age of Humans, what could be the problem with that? Well, it turns out a huge amount of problems could be associated with the Anthropocene. And again, we want to be very careful about using a language really developed to talk about stratigraphy and geological history and its application to human history, which of course is always more than human history.
And do you see yourself as following in the footsteps of Marx, or do you want to depart from him in some way?
Well, I think Marx wanted to depart from Marx. Marx famously writes to the French socialists and he says, well, if this is Marxism, then I am not a Marxist. He writes to the German socialists in the 1870s famously, and he criticizes them for giving labor supernatural power. So supernatural is his phrase. Marx was a relentlessly heterodox figure who was a man of his times, like everyone, and saw some things and didn't see other things. I think that the problem with Marxism is that it becomes a kind of stone tablet, Moses coming down from the mountainside way of seeing the world. And Marx, of course, would have been furious about that. So Marx was always revising, renewing, extending how he was looking at the world. For me, Marx gives us a way of seeing the world that is about relations, it's about flows, and it is about the connection of history to our present moment. Of course, this conversation here is a historical moment, and of course, a concern with liberation and emancipation. Now, as some of your listeners might know or might not, I have been roundly denounced by the orthodox Marxists as a deviant and a blasphemer. And I have been regularly denounced by anti-communist theorists, critical theorists, especially in the environmental humanities, as an orthodox Marxist. So I'm not sure what that makes me. For me, I'm interested in understanding history and how the present is shaped by history 5 years ago, 50 years ago, 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago. Marx and Engels have this great metaphor at one point that is deeply relevant to our conversation about the Anthropocene. They say they liken historical change and historical process to geological layers. That's the imagery that they use. And I think that that's something that advocates of the Anthropocene in a historical sense have forgotten to put into play. That there is this deeper history of layers of, call them civilizations, call them systems, call them modes of production, but of these complexes of power, production and reproduction, of domination, and also of resistance to domination. There are these streams that flow into the river of history that is the climate crisis today. And we should attend to that very carefully. And for me, that's what Marx is always insisting on. He's not insisting on one holy scripture. He's insisting on looking at history as it really is and trying to make sense of it in a way that does not share the illusions of the time that we're living in. So that's, again, the Anthropocene age of man. It is hard to have a more modernist way of understanding the crisis of modernity. And as Einstein would remind us, the thinking that created the crisis is unlikely to allow us to make sense of the crisis or do something about the crisis.
So this is a history of cheapness. What does the term cheapness help us to understand?
So cheapness, first of all, helps us understand this double reality of capital accumulation, the enrichment of the 1%, and the violence and impoverishment of not just humans, but the rest of nature over 5 centuries. And cheapness is one process with two great moments. One is that for ruling classes, for empires, for merchants, for financiers, for plantation owners, cheapness was a strategy to reduce in price all the elements of production. It was essentially a strategy to turn the whole web of life into profit-making opportunities. So one part of it is what we can think of as economic or political economic. The other moment, and the political economic would not have succeeded without this other moment, is a moment of cheapening, of devaluation, of the degradation of the dignity of the life and labors of women, nature, and colonies, in the words of Maria Mies. That is to show how cheapness as a strategy of rule and power and accumulation is not only about economics, which it is, but is also about the cultural and political devaluation of the vast majority of humankind. And as I mentioned, to put most human beings in the category not of civilization, but of nature. So from Columbus and the Spaniards with their Christianizing projects to very quickly the British with their civilizing projects and the French under the sign of improvement to developmentalism. the developmental proclamation of Truman in 1949, the famous Point 4 address, where with the stroke of a pen, he declared about 80% of the world's population as undeveloped. So to be unchristian, uncivilized, undeveloped, this is at the core of cheapening projects, from Christianizing projects to developmentalist projects. This gives us a way to put together the cultural politics, which are very powerful and real, the political economy, and the environmental history, including the climate history, as all entangled with each other at the same time. And that's what's so often missing from many environmentalist discussions, but also, perhaps you were hinting at this, and maybe many labor, socialist, and Marxist discussions.
And the story of Columbus features at the start of each chapter, I believe. Now, what can Columbus tell us about the destruction of the planet and capitalism more generally?
So in Columbus, we can find so many of the elements of modern power, modern rule, modern views towards the web of life. We quote from his diary how he mentions the word gold something like 72 times in his diary of the first voyage. He is constantly, and he was not unique in this, he was constantly looking for profit-making opportunities. This indeed characterizes European colonialism from the era of Columbus all the way to the era of Monsanto and bioprospecting in the neoliberal era, this approach to looking for surveying the web of life in terms of profit-making opportunities. So what we do in drawing together the origins of the modern world and then looking at its subsequent development with Columbus is we show this was not an aberration. Columbus very much demonstrates the core of capitalism's view and capitalism's valuation of the world at the moment when capitalism was still forming. It didn't come fully formed like Athena out of some Zeus-like crisis. Capitalism emerged, it developed, it took shape, it became progressively more capitalist over time. And I think what Columbus, the story of Columbus shows, or at least that's what we hope, is that it brings together these three moments I mentioned, the moments of political and cultural degradation and devaluation, of political economy and the accumulation of capital, and environmental history, and showing how each of these moments is so intimately connected to the other that we have to really begin, if we want to make sense of the climate crisis, we have to look at our history and at the origins of, in this case, the origins of planetary apartheid, the origins of the planetary class divide, and link it to climate histories, genocides, dispossessions as something more than a long, terrible, and sad story of violence, degradation, and oppression. In order to understand why there are 8 billionaires today with more wealth than the bottom 3.5 billion with a B people in the world, we need to look at the origins of capitalism, the origins of a way of organizing not just power, not just economy, but all the web of life and how we think about the web of life. And for us, that story was opened up by Columbus. And as I like to say to my students and to anyone who will listen, in my view, 1492 never ended. We are still living in 1492.
And chapter 2 is called Cheap Money, where you talk about Columbus's relation with the Genoese banking and finance system. Now, what role does finance play in the accentuation of capitalism and
this is
the cheapening of life? Yeah.
This is so important, and this was one of my light bulb experiences, one of my epiphanies in writing this with Raj. That we tend to think, and Marxists especially think, oh, finance was something that wasn't really that significant. It comes in much, much later, maybe in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, you have major banking crises and all of this. Well, it turns out that between the years roughly 1482 and 1492, the Spanish crown, which was a very wobbly construct at the time, the Spanish crown engages in 3 great ethnic cleansing campaigns. One is the reconquest of the last Muslim kingdom on Iberia, Granada. The other is the conquest of the Canary Islands, which is still possessed by Spain. And the other was the invasion of the Americas, of course, in 1492. Each one of those moments was financed by Genoese and Florentine capitalists. Here's the thing about waging war, and it's true even for the United States today, that you don't pay for war with taxes. You pay for war in a modern sense by borrowing money. And so you are dependent on your borrowing. You are dependent on credit in order to wage war. So that was the origins, in a sense, of a, if not a military industrial, certainly a military financial complex that has, as we know, brought untold horrors to the peoples of the world ever since. But it's also linked, so you have conquest and credit that are linked there. But it's connected, and this for us, and really for, I think for both of us, was a real light bulb moment. The only thing that the states, so that Castile, the core of modern Spain, the only thing Spain could get out of conquest were slaves. And so right there you have slavery, finance, war, conquest, linked from the very, very beginning of capitalism. And we talk about how war making, not just in terms of slaving, although when this model was carried to the Americas, we need to point out, we need to recognize that it wasn't microbes that killed 95% of the American Indian population. Yes, microbes would have typhus, smallpox, all the rest would have killed a certain share of the population regardless, but not 95%. It was this complex of money, slavery, and war that drove the genocide to horrific extents. In fact, so great, as we just talked about, so great that it changed the world's climate by the early 17th century, if not earlier. So it's not just that, but it's also the war machine of capitalism was deeply financialized from the beginning and becomes this way of producing modern life with its standardization, with its industrialization, the capacity for massive destructive and mobile destructive power in the world. And to leave that out is to pretend that capitalism is just an economic system of producing more efficiently and selling more competitively. No, at every step, from Columbus all the way to the Cold War and the American endless occupations and wars in the Middle East, capitalism has really been saved and propelled by a military, financial, military-industrial complex.
And chapter 5 is called Cheap Food. Can you tell us what you argue in that?
So as we say, cheap food is never a bargain. And we have all become all too aware of the horrific consequences to health, to public health, over, well, especially over the past 50 years in the advanced capitalist world, but now increasingly everywhere as these hyper-processed, hyper-manufactured, corn syrup dependent, the cornification of all kinds of food, everything is sweet, everything is disastrous. We paint that as the predictable outcome of an economic development model that does begin again in the era of Columbus, but then becomes what we call industrial agriculture in places like the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. If you're familiar with the term Green Revolution, that is the projection globally of the American industrial agricultural revolution model developed in the 1930s. But what we show is that has a very long history. And it's not just about places like England. So a lot of people read, say, Marx on enclosures, or they have this storybook sense that, well, it all begins in England. And first of all, sorry, it doesn't all begin in England. The English learned to farm from the Dutch, and there's an interesting history with that. But the basic model is this. It is produce more and more and more food with less and less and less average labor. So you can have some people working very long, but if you look at the average labor and the average commodity, or what Marx calls abstract social labor, which always kind of confused me when I heard that term. But if you think about it as the average labor and the average commodity in the world, or the average labor in agriculture, we have seen a series of great agricultural revolutions in which more and more food is produced with less and less labor power. Well, that's a big deal. That's the fundamental model that underpins everything. It underpins our conversation here. It underpins the stock market, the financial markets, everything in the world, the rise of China. So if you cannot grow more and more food with less and less labor power, then it becomes difficult to pursue capitalism, which is based on the proletarianization of labor and more workers freed to work outside of industry. Now, that story is often told in terms of the United States or England and then Britain or the Low Countries, but in fact it has a vital and fundamental moment in the history of sugar and the sugar plantation in these centuries after Columbus. Of course, sugar is still hugely important in various senses of that term, hugely important in the world, but industrial agriculture is really born in the colonies. It's really born out of racialized labor and slavery and massive capital accumulation. And in both rich countries and in the colonies, that form of agriculture devastated soils, devastated the local biological diversity in usually islands, but not always, in one island or one region after another. We tell the story of Madeira, which was really, Madeira is this very small island, about 500, 600 kilometers west off the coast of Morocco. And there you see the elements of the birthplace of industrial agriculture, of slavery, of environmental devastation. So again, these three moments of cultural politics, political economy, environmental history. And what we're showing is that the history of cheap agriculture is a strategy of not just enriching a few, not just of making possible capitalism, but also devaluing soils and devaluing the humans who work them. So this is a way of making sense of cheap food as a strategy of power, as a strategy of development that has in fact been premised on extraordinary violence and extraordinary oppression all the way from Columbus to the present. So when we talk about cheap food, we say this again and again and again. It's not the $2 hamburger or £2 hamburger that you can buy. It's really how cheap is it for the 1% so that their workers can be reproduced profitably. And then it's about looking at the struggles around cheap food as well, because we point out that all of the cheaps that we talk about are resisted, are actively organized against by the vast majority in different ways, by women and people of color and workers and all the ways in which those categories overlap and inform each other. We talk about how that this is also a battleground, that cheap food is a class struggle.
And chapter 7's got the very dark title of Cheap Lives. Now, what do you set out in that chapter?
Well, if anything, I think we were too polite in that chapter. That is, of course, a story of the cheapening of lives through the dominant structures of empire, racism, and sexism. So this idea that today's, what I call the trinity of the climate class divide, climate apartheid, climate patriarchy, has its origins in the cheapening of human lives, but of course always more than human lives at the same time. And cheap lives is a way of opening up this question of whose lives and whose labors are valued and whose are devalued. And as feminists and anti-colonial critics have long pointed out, the most valuable work provided is also the most devalued. So the feminist argument has been clear on this, and I think is absolutely spot on, associated with the ideas of people like Claudia von Verelhoff, that the capacity of women to produce life means that that capacity has to be radically devalued. And that's a devaluation of life and a devaluation of labor, again, in multiple senses of this term. And capitalism couldn't run without that. So if capitalism, for instance, and this is again an old feminist Marxist argument, If capitalism had to pay the cost of all the social reproduction and domestic labor that women overwhelmingly perform in the world, nobody would be able to make a buck. The profit and accumulation would be impossible because it would be simply too expensive. So that work has to be devalued in both an economic sense, but also, of course, as we know, in a bodily sense. The violence that is legitimated, valorized, licensed by ruling class agencies from the 16th century all the way to the present is not just a terrible, sad story. It's fundamental to capitalism's business as usual.
If you don't mind, can I play the devil's advocate on this?
Of course.
So you could say that communism wasn't exactly great for the planet either. Mao Zedong declared a war on nature. You had the Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine. Now, what would you say to someone who was to put forward a case like that?
Well, first of all, let's be aware that the Soviet Union and China were never outside of capitalism. I think that's the first thing that we need to understand, that these were modernizing anti-colonial revolutions. That's one thing I would point out, that it becomes very difficult, especially in the Anglo-American world, to talk in a rather reasoned and sober way about the experience of China and the Soviet Union, because of the power of anti-communism, which enforces the view that these people were either stupid, evil, or incompetent, or maybe all at the same time. And as I often point out, that the single greatest contribution to the well-being and sustainability, however you want to define the sustainability of life on this planet, the greatest contribution in the 20th century was the Soviet defeat of Nazism. So if we want to draw balance sheets, we should do so in a sober way. Now, that statement, does that mean that it's acceptable to liquidate hundreds of thousands of party members in the Great Purges? Does it mean it was okay to liquidate the Ukrainian peasantry? Well, of course not. But it's impossible under the, as long as we really accept, as much of the left has done, if we accept the anti-communist picture that emerges out of the anti-colonial revolutions of Russia and China, and that point cannot be underscored nearly heavily enough. So the Soviet Union, especially the Russian Revolution, comes out of an era in which between 1916 and 1945, 38 million human beings who lived on Russian territory were killed by imperial war, as a result of imperialist war. So why that's not laid at the doorsteps of the imperialist system is beyond me. Now, again, this doesn't excuse all of the many idiotic mistakes and colossal errors that any state building project engages in, especially a modernist or even high modernist, as the Soviets were, kind of project. So we want to really take to heart how the environmental history of the 20th century has been shaped by these anti-colonial revolutions. The Chinese and the Soviets were the most spectacular of them. And let's also remember this, people forget this now, but the language of ecocide was taken out of the historical experience of the United States and Vietnam. Of course, the United States wages a protracted chemical biological war on the Vietnamese that results in the deaths of 3 million Vietnamese. Somehow the American experience is not discredited, apparently, from that. The American legitimacy is discredited from that, but it was taken out of that and applied to the Soviet Union. Well, yes, there were, as it was a modernist project, fundamentally. It was never outside of capitalism. It was a developmentalist state. But it's important to remember the Soviet Union was never more than 10% of the world economy at its height. China was never more than 3 or 4% of the world economy at its height. And both of them were pushed and driven towards a hyper-developmentalist project by either the actual threat and reality of imperialist war, or by the threat of nuclear annihilation. So these were not episodes in the history of capitalism, which altogether come to maybe, I mean, I don't know how we want to define it, 50, 75 years at the absolute most out of 500. It's always interesting to me that we want to sort of elevate the experience of these two very poor countries, these colonial, Russia was always in a weird spot because it was always by far the poorest of the great powers. It was never a rich country. The revolution itself was an anti-colonial revolution, China much more obviously so, but both decisively shaped by attack and occupation by fascist empires. So it's something that is very important to think about when we look at the possible future scenarios, because we want to learn from these experiences in ways that I think draw the balance sheet in very, very obvious ways and don't engage in, frankly, weird and ahistorical periodizations like most of what the Soviet Union was doing, say, around the Aral Sea, where everybody rightly condemns that, that was begun by the Tsarists in the 1860s. So that doesn't make what the Soviets did good. It just simply points to the long-term continuities of developmentalism in a capitalist world ecology. So I think it's a third rail of radical politics. And the way that I try to deal with this in a more nuanced way is that I simply point out that everything about the Soviet experience was integrated in the most deeply intimate ways with the rest of capitalism. In fact, one of my favorite examples is that the Soviets copy American mass production plants. They hire the architects who designed Henry Ford's River Rouge auto plant, which at one point employed 60,000 workers. They hire the architects to design industrial plants in the Soviet Union, and that's not the only example that I could give. So if there was one country in the 20th century that emulated the United States more than any other, it was the Soviet Union. And so sometimes I call the Soviet Union Fordism with socialist characteristics, which is a kind of Chinese turn of phrase. But I think you get the sense that, yeah, you know, I mean, we're living in a violent and unequal capitalist world, and the Soviets were a part of that. And I think it would be a mistake to say that it was at the same level as the American and other imperialist countries in the 20th century, simply because they were never independent from threat of attack and nuclear annihilation.
And do you think capitalism's a coherent term to use in that there's been so many different forms of capitalism? So in Marx's time, it was industrial capitalism. Today we have more financialized, neoliberal, platform capitalism, even surveillance capitalism, even. Mm-hmm. Do you think the term still manages to capture the essence of all those different variations?
Well, I like to say this about all of my favorite terms. When somebody comes up with something better, please, I will be the first in line to be using it. That I think the modification of capitalism is healthy, is appropriate. Of course, what we're dealing with is it's not a monolith. And to say capitalism and then give it a definition is inherently problematic, because capitalism is a historical system that emerges, that grows, that has some characteristics at one point in life and others at other points of life. So in that sense, an organicist metaphor is not always misleading, that when we are children, we have different physical and emotional hormonal balances than when we are 30 or 60 or 90. And like all living creatures, civilizations, historical systems, world ecologies, whatever you want to call them, they have a life course. No civilization lasts forever. So if we are using capitalism as a kind of monolithic definitional hammer to go bludgeon other people, and bludgeon other ideas, then I think that is not a very useful way of thinking about the world. But if we are looking at the long-term, large-scale patterns of expansion, of crisis, of evolution and recurrence over the past 5 centuries, then it becomes indispensable because, first of all, it names the particular logic of reproducing class power and enriching the bourgeoisie, the 1% at the expense of everyone else. It names, identifies, and interprets a particular logic of wealth accumulation, and it allows us in a more connective and relational sense of the term to draw connections, as I like to say, from the microbiome that lives in our gut to the biosphere and everywhere in between. And it's a connective concept. It's a concept that at its best can allow us to go out into the world and make connections that are unexpected and unpredictable. So that's very important, and especially when we look at the web of life, and so the relationship of how capitalism operates and has historically developed within the web of life. It is subject to, say, Milankovitch cycles, these long cycles of how the Earth moves about the sun. It's subject to climate shifts. It's subject to biological transfers all around the world. But also, it's a way of seeing the world that helps us. Capitalism is a way of seeing the world and organizing life into these categories of society and nature, and using that not just as ideas, not just as descriptions, but as ruling abstractions. They are actually embedded in the fundamental exercise of class power over the past 5 centuries. And that's going to sound very Marxist and might make some people uncomfortable. But I think if you look at environmental history and how that's connected to long-term patterns, say, of racialized labor, of gendered labor, you start to get a sense of how they are all feeding off each other. That capitalism is about far more than economics. So I always say capitalism is not an economic system. It has that, it contains an economic system. It is a way of organizing power and webs of life.
And what do you make of policies? I know it's not a coherent policy and there's lots of different variations and details about it. What do you make of things such as the Green New Deal? Do you think they're radical enough?
Well, I think that yes and no. The Green New Deal has mobilized extraordinary excitement, and I think of the great little book that Thea Rianfrancos and Danielle Aldana Cohen and their colleagues put out with Verso recently. Very, very smart, brilliant, radical people, and they've been mobilizing this radical vision of a Green New Deal or a global Green New Deal, and we have to support that. We have to look for ways to extend that conversation, because it is one indispensable wedge that can open up some space to transcend this jobs versus environment, labor versus environment divide, which has characterized especially the neoliberal era, and has really left much of big E environmentalist politics as either implicitly or explicitly neoliberal in orientation. So it's a way to open up conversations that we've not had. Now, at the same time, we want to, again, be very sober about our historical evaluations of the New Deal itself. The New Deal was very consciously and deliberately a containment plan to roll back a great wave of labor unrest that was of a specific kind. These were not strikes in an economistic sense. They had economic dimensions, but they were what David Montgomery calls worker control strikes. So the Green New Deal, or the New Deal rather, was very much about the containment of labor's power and its incorporation into an American version of social democratic politics that quickly, very quickly, by 46 and 47, led to the defanging of labor, to the anti-communist purges, and to a very, very different kind of American politics than what we saw in the 1930s. Now, we also have to be very clear that the New Deal did very little to lead American capitalism into a new phase of growth. That was wartime mobilization. It was mobilization for World War II that essentially resolves the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so when we're looking at these questions, we have a lot of thorny historical issues that come up with our metaphors, but we are nitpicky at our peril. So we want to try to do both ends. We want to. I have many comrades who I respect and admire who are pushing for some kind of Green New Deal, and I'm not sure where that's going to lead, but I think that that's the excitement of it.
I won't keep you for too much longer. I've got two more. You use a phrase in the book that's quite interesting. It's called reparative ecology. What do you mean by that?
So reparation is usually thought of as making monetary payments, but for us, we like to go to the repair moment of reparation, of reparative ecologies of healing, and that healing for us and radical action for Raj and I think it's fair to speak for both of us, involves not just moving forward with a plan, but remembering and overcoming the anesthetizing impacts of bourgeois hegemony that teach us, for instance, to ignore the reality that capitalism is built on a long series of genocidal campaigns, from Columbus all the way to the late Victorian Holocaust of the late 19th century, as Mike Davis talks about, to, of course, the Nazi genocide of Jewish and attempted genocide of Slavic people. So we want, it's a way of, and this is at the heart of what we call world ecology, not the ecology of the world, but a way of seeing past and present society and nature, humans and the rest of nature, as fundamentally interconnected into these new complexes of relationships that we point out that remembering is necessary to repairing. And reparations involves more than acknowledging. It means formulating a vision of revolutionary transformation that takes seriously this double moment of cheapening, the economic moment and the domination and oppression moment, and seeing how they are intimately connected at every turn in the web of life. And so that's a way of speaking again to this economic versus ecology divide, jobs versus environment divide that we've seen for so long, but also an even more dangerous and misleading divide between oppression and exploitation. And the notion that there are working classes that are exploited that have their own dynamic of revolution, and then systems of oppression that have their own. In fact, they're much more intimately connected, as many scholars now, feminist and anti-racist and class scholars for many years have been pointing out. But we point they are all connected not just with each other, but with the web of life.
And I'll finish with this one. Do you believe Frederick Jameson's dictum that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism? Do you see a future? Do you see a future beyond capitalism?
Well, of course, there's a future beyond capitalism. Capitalism is on it, as we have known it for the past 5 centuries, is on its way out. So if we look at the major climate crises, climate shifts in the Northern Hemisphere over the past, say, 4,000 years, what you see is that from the Bronze Age crisis to the Dark Ages cold period of late antiquity and the collapse of Western Rome, to the coming of the Little Ice Age in the 14th century, to the most severe, intense period of the Little Ice Age in the 17th century, these were all moments of profound upheaval, of profound crisis. The moments of climate change in a significant way are always moments of political possibility. Whether the reproducing classes are capable of navigating that and taking advantage of those possibilities is a different question. But what is clear is that it is extremely difficult for ruling classes to, under conditions of severe climate change, of really dramatic climate change, to weather the storms. In the 17th century, Europe's ruling classes did that by moving aggressively towards the Americas and setting up vast new production complexes reliant on slave labor in the tropical zones of the world. So it was very much a tropical capitalism fix. Obviously, that recourse and that reality is not our reality today. So moments of climate change are moments of political and social unrest and destabilization. That should give us hope. Obviously, there is a lot of extraordinary violence, inequality, suffering that is going on in the world right now. But that's not so different from the past 5 centuries for the vast majority of human beings on this planet. And we want to just take a pause. It's too much of eco-left thinking says what comes next is the worst imaginable world and maybe yes, maybe no, but it's not like the past 5 centuries and the past century itself, especially, have been any cakewalk. So when we look at the catastrophist mindset, which has practitioners that are very mainstream and very radical, it's not that real catastrophes aren't unfolding. It's not that they haven't been unfolding or will continue to unfold. It is that we want to be careful about a kind of doomsday leftism. And then you end up with, well, we can imagine the writers, like I forget the name of the English writer who took his family off to the coast of Ireland associated with the Dark Mountain Project. So let's just check out because everything is going to become apocalyptic. Well, I'm not sure. The climate crisis of the 4th and 5th century led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and its vast apparatus of a slave mode of production. Peasants reestablished village life and reorganized production and reproduction on a dramatically egalitarian basis and pursued diverse livelihood strategies so they lived better. So that's just an example. Yes, the present is very much different from the 5th century in Western Europe, but we want to be aware that the collapse of or the crisis or unsettling of the power of the 1% of the ruling classes in an era of dramatic climate change presents real opportunities to build a different world. And we really have to be open, and this goes back to a lot of the questions that you asked, we really have to be open to the widest range of imagination. And so sometimes when we get into environmentalism or Marxism or anarchism or any number of other camps like that, there is a kind of closure of the imagination and a tendency to narrow political positions to the good guys and the bad guys. And I do happen to believe there are bad guys. I don't think Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos should be celebrated as saviors of the environment. But we should look in a connective way across these domains that I've been talking about, the political economy of capitalism, the long-term dynamics of oppression and domination, and the webs of life, and look at how other worlds could be constructed out of the ruins of capitalism, which are the ruins that we see right before us.
Okay, Jason Moore, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.